Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Vance, and I am Information Literacy Librarian here at the Walker Library. Thanks for coming out. I'm very happy to see such a big crowd. I told Sheila I was going to try to keep this very apolitical in talking about fake news, but I must say this is the largest crowd that has ever been assembled for one of these workshops, ever. Much bigger than last week's crowd, so yeah. Don't take any pictures, but it's a huge crowd. So this workshop came to be as the result of a faculty. I said no pictures. A faculty learning community that was 2014-2015 sponsored through the LT and ITC that was focused on information literacy. And the group that was working on that, the group of interdisciplinary faculty, went on to kind of evolve and morph into a new group that is sponsored through the library with Dean Alex Blessing. That is an information literacy faculty advisory group. And again, each year we have a little turnover in the membership, but it's a group of faculty who are interested in how students are using information across disciplines. And so this panel is a result of that ongoing conversation that's now been going for a few years. So it sort of predates some of the current events and fake news that we've been hearing a lot about. But so today we're casting a very wide net to talk about information generally, so both news and also scholarship and the kinds of things that are showing up in your students' papers. So we hope that you're here for this engaging conversation and to hear from our panel of experts, and that you're not here out of a desperation for the sad state of your students' works cited pages. So either way, we're happy to have you, and we have several short presentations. So what I've asked each of our panelists to do is to prepare 7 to 10 minutes for a presentation, and we will kind of blow through those. What I would encourage you to do is take notes, because we've got a lot of content, and we're going to save whatever time is left at the end for discussion and questions for the entire panel. So with that, I will turn things over to Ken Paulson, who's Dean in the College of Media and Entertainment. And I'm going to skip introductions in the interest of time and just have everyone introduce themselves when they stand up. But first, Dean Paulson. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to
magic.
I was going to sit, but I want to see if this thing can follow me. In the interest of full disclosure, I spent 35 years as a professional journalist. I came here after being the editor of 5 different newspapers, including the last few years as editor of USA Today. So I have strong opinions about the news, fake and otherwise. One of the challenges we all face when we talk to our students about fake news is that those two words are now loaded. You know, fake was an adjective, news was a noun, and rarely did they come together. Until 1 year ago, when Facebook, Zuckerberg announced that they were going to try to fight fake news. And that's the first time that fake news actually trended and went viral. It became a thing. What he meant was fraudulent news, news that has no factual basis. But that two-word phrase became weaponized in January of this year when President Trump, at his earliest press exchange, called CNN fake news. Here's your dilemma. If you're teaching, if you use fake news, you've actually just underscored the president's position about America's journalism. He wasn't talking about fabricated news. He was talking about real news and real journalists. So I want to encourage anybody who's interested in pursuing this in a classroom to try to find another word, because fake news is just a way of undermining what exists in terms of America's news media. And it's crazy that we use fake news as a term. A fake designer handbag is a counterfeit. A fake CD is a bootleg. A fake diamond ring is cubic zirconia. Everything fake has a real name, but only we have allowed this administration and critics of the press to use those two words as though it were a real thing. And in our classrooms, we need to try to resist that temptation. Call it what it is. A fake news story is a lie, is a fabrication, is a hoax. And those have been around a lot longer than fake news has been. I just have 4 words that I try to apply when I teach about the difference between real content and fake content, if you will. And that is the phrase, know why you know. And I think it's good practice to challenge each of your classes when you talk about issues to explain why they know what they believe they know. And when you get to that, then you begin to get answers like, well, I know because I read in the Harvard Law Review. Or my buddy Pat posted it on the internet. And when you do that analysis, you begin to understand very, very quickly that the origins of content make all the difference in the world. And if you routinely begin to do that analysis, you're getting an immediate clue into the content and veracity. The question is not where it's posted. It's not about Twitter. It's not about Facebook. It's about the guarantor of that information, the verifier of that information. And that's critically important for students to understand. And knowing why you know makes all the difference in the world. I will tell you that I do take personally this discussion of media, fake news, because I'm so personally offended by it. I will tell you that in the news business, and this is self-justifying, I suppose, but I've been a lawyer. I've had the privilege in recent years of being an academic and educator, and I've been a journalist. With no disrespect to anyone in the room, including the provost, the most stringent ethical standards were in journalism. The most stringently enforced ethical standards were in journalism. People who make stories up, their career is over immediately. I became editor of USA Today, not because my predecessor at USA Today had done something horrible. No, she just didn't spot somebody on her staff who was making things up. And because she wasn't vigilant enough, she was out. It's an industry that eats its young and its rivals. And so CNN had to retract a story this past week. Who reported on that? The Washington Post and the New York Times with glee. When mistakes are made, they become very visible. It's a very transparent industry. And integrity is everything. It is a neurotically honest industry, with the exception of what you all know, the pandering cable networks we have today. And that is our dilemma, those of us who have to defend freedom of the press. I also do First Amendment legal work. Our dilemma is that when people think of the media, they think of it as a singular somehow, and they think of Fox and MSNBC, and one of those two everyone hates. Everyone in America, one of those two everyone hates. But those are to news. Fox and other pandering channels are to news what pornography is to literature. Titillating, holds your interest for short periods of time, absolutely no informational value. And that's also something we need to convey to students, that just seeing something on Fox News or MSNBC doesn't make it anywhere near locked in stone and accurate. I just also wanted to share that that there are other words that are loaded in this debate, and a phrase is media and biased media. And there are so many efforts. I will just tell you that in my tenure at USA Today, I had a picture every day. It's still there, same guy. And it just says, tell me if we got anything wrong. And if somebody wrote, we convened an internal investigation. And he's still doing that same job today. And then I would send letters to people we wrote about. And they would, and I would say, did we do a good job or not? Now, this is not about telling you what a swell editor I am. I'm telling you those are the standards of the industry, in part because it's in their interest not to get sued for libel, and so they're very, very careful. So media bias has become a similar weapon. And I will tell you, I will give you the very best reason why media bias is not a real concern today. All the past century we've had highly biased newspapers, Republican newspapers, Democratic newspapers. Today they're just trying to survive. And they have not even run editorials in many cases because they didn't want to lose their readership if they picked the wrong presidential candidate. And the other thing is the dynamic about reporters today, and it's always about them. You think that if they voted for Obama and and came across a story that would embarrass him for all time, they wouldn't quickly post that? No. It's every man and woman for themselves. It's ambition over bias, and that self-interest what keeps them honest. And that's 7 minutes. Thank you very much. No. I want to be on camera throughout this presentation.
Good. I hope you look very interested the whole time. Okay. Thank you very much.
Next up we have
sorry.
Molly Taylor-Koleski from the Department of History.
Well, thank you. Ken, for setting up my talk so nicely, because a lot of the problems that you set up are things that I'm trying to solve in my class. Just kidding. But I'm trying to give my students some tools to deal with. That's your Prezi. Here we go. Okay. So I am a new history professor, and I teach 2 sections of the Gen Ed required History 2010, which is the U.S. Survey to 1877. And what I get the opportunity to do in that class is introduce historical thinking throughout the entire semester. And I start in class 1 with an exercise which gets students engaged right away and is pretty popular because we show a clip from Disney, where they deconstruct the story that we have received about Pocahontas, starting with what they already think they know about Pocahontas. And pictorial images of her from her lifetime. But we, of course, go back to the original documents that mention Pocahontas, and starting with John Smith, when he first arrives in Virginia, his descriptions from 1608, 1609, when he's captured by Pocahontas' father, Powhatan, and released. And there's absolutely no mention of Pocahontas in that first description. A few years later, she magically appears, and I separate the students into groups. They each dissect a certain document and ask the question, who wrote this? What might have been their interest in writing this? And how is Pocahontas described? So once they're done with that exercise, we go through chronologically through the different documents, the pictorial and written documents, and kind of build up the story as we know it. And all the time they're asking, why did this person describe Pocahontas in the way they did? Why did John Smith's story change to include Pocahontas? And they sort of get into deeper questions about what did Pocahontas serve for the Virginia Company or for John Smith as he's trying to encourage British to come to the New World. Well, she's a nice kind of crossover character who's easy to bring into the English fold. She converts to Christianity. She's approachable. She's royalty. These are all things that weren't attached to her in the original description. And when we view the story from a different cultural lens, kind of looking westwards from Pocahontas' culture back to Europe, we see the story in a whole different light. So that's just where we jump off from the class. And we do other exercises getting to those primary questions. Who wrote this source? Why did they write it? What's their interest in telling the story in the way they do? And eventually we get into secondary sources that do that. We get into how historians use primary sources to make an argument. And then, of course, the students find their own primary source. Ken Middleton helps them find that primary source. Is this the mouse for this computer? Oh, okay. So they get experience doing what I call historical thinking throughout the semester. And then in the last class, I bring that back to contemporary America and how we receive news all the time. And, of course, I was also encouraged after the election last year to think about these issues after Zuckerberg made that statement. And I saw a lot of publicity about the Stanford Education Group and the work that they had done investigating how middle school and high school students interpret news or how they get news. And 88% of middle schoolers and high schoolers, I don't think this will surprise anyone, get their news from internet sources. I imagine it's much higher than that for my students, just judging from the way that people seem glued to some form of internet connection between classes, wherever they go. So I brought out another story in my last lecture, and this is a story that I sort of deconstructed for them. Am I running out of time? Another kind of myth in American culture about fake protesters being bussed into Austin the day after the election. And so I would sort of walk them through this story in the same way I did with the Pocahontas story about a single observer of buses in Austin making the connection that he had heard that there were fake protesters and now there are people getting off of buses. So that must mean that these were paid protesters. And he puts that out on Twitter. Within a few hours, it gets picked up by the conservative Reddit site. Make America Great Again. It gets over 200 comments. Almost 400 comments. It's shared almost 5,000 times. It's picked up by a very popular conservative Facebook page, freerepublic.com. Over 300,000 people share the link. This is under 24 hours from the original post, and we have photographic evidence confirming what we already knew, basically. But now we have the evidence. Okay, so this story is spreading very quickly, and finally a real journalist chime in and start asking, okay, at Eric Tucker, were you able to verify that those were protesters after they unloaded the bus? And Eric Tucker responds to the journalist, I did not see loading or unloading. There were even more buses than the pics quite near protests at the right time. So journalists start to investigate this. They even start to call the bus company. And lo and behold, there was a conference in Austin that day with 30,000 participants, and those buses had been moving conference participants around, had nothing to do with any protests. But this is already picked up, and by the evening of November 10th, 2 days after it was originally tweeted, the president-elect tweets out to his millions of followers, just had a very open and successful presidential election. Now professional protesters incited by the media, are protesting. Very unfair. Okay. Right-wing news picks this up. Well. Like it confirms what we already knew. So then Eric Tucker, people turn to him and he says, look, even the President of the United States, future President of the United States knew about this. And so when people ask him, he feels like that's confirmation, where Donald Trump was referring to his tweet as his evidence of this happening. So within 3 days, Eric Tucker realizes that he was not correct in his assumption, and he tries to retract his story. He says false, and he writes on Twitter, and boom, the old big bad post is gone, its memory shall live on. Thanks all, let's keep the conversation moving. So he thinks he's done his job. Oopsie, I made a mistake. Do you know how many times this was retweeted? For the millions of times his original post was tweeted? It's maybe 500 times. Okay, so his story indeed lived on, and more than he realized. So I like to walk my students through that story, and I do get the same chuckles that I heard here. And then we deconstruct web pages, particularly news pages, like the Fox News web page, and even HuffPo, and deconstruct how you can ask these same types of questions, and also think about all of those little sponsored links or unsponsored links, and distinguish between news that's made by journalists, and I talk about what that means, that there's an objective voice that journalists strive for, and that they're fact-checked just in the way that those secondary sources, those historians, were peer-reviewed to publish in those journals. I'm very explicit about what that actually means, and then I try and walk them through the aesthetics of a web page that might intentionally or unintentionally deceive you as you're receiving all these bits of information. So that's a practical exercise I use in my class. Thanks.
While I was getting set up, this is Eric Detweiler from the Department of English.
It's true. It's all true.
Yeah.
Okay, so in my quick presentation today, I want to present two brief suggestions for how to teach students to recognize fake news stories, or I should probably say fraudulent or fabricated news stories. And the first of these two will dovetail, I think, especially nicely with where Molly left off, which is that we need to teach them how to recognize and navigate some of the norms of web design and add a little bit more nuance in the ways we talk to them about URLs or web addresses, right? And the second point, which may be a little more provocative, is that we should give students the chance to try their hand at writing fake news. So first, my first suggestion started with this tweet. As you may or may not be able to gather, this is a Twitter account run by an anonymous person who works in information security, but whose Twitter persona is inspired by Taylor Swift, like basically what would happen if Taylor Swift worked in information security. Anyway, all that aside, this tweet was posted in November 2016 when the controversies around fabricated news were really peaking. So as the poster says, they have an advantage when it comes to spotting fake news because, quote, I know what a CMS template designed by professionals who hate their lives is supposed to look like. So for those of you who aren't familiar, CMS is short for Content Management System. Right, and CMSs are platforms like WordPress or Drupal or Joomla that are typically used in the building of websites. The point I want to draw from this tweet is that recognizing fake news isn't just about spotting gaps or contradictions in the spoken or written words of a news story, but also can have to do with the way it's designed, particularly if it's housed on a website. So I'm going to shift directions for a second, but I'll come back to this in just a moment. Now, when I ask students in my first year writing courses what they've been taught about when it comes to distinguishing like reliable sources from unreliable online sources, their response often boils down to this. .gov and .edu sites are good, .com and .net sites and Wikipedia are bad. Now, of course, this ignores the fact that information provided by a .gov website might be closely tied to the political affiliations of the people who run the organization, and that some .edu websites, right, might just be projects by first-year students at other institutions, right, who are using their institution's server space to post those projects. Moreover, plenty of reputable news organizations have .com addresses, right, even if the same is true for sort of hyper-partisan media organizations as well. So there's more nuance to be had here. And interestingly, if you visit Wikipedia, you can find another wrinkle here. So many of the fake news sites that were operating during the 2016 presidential election were .co sites, and they were meant to sort of imitate like news.com websites, but adding an extra .co at the end. So for instance, in this fabricated story about Scientology, you may notice that it looks like ABC News, right? But it's abcnews.com.co. But if you know how a professional news website typically looks, you can quickly begin to notice some weird stuff. Like there's no logo, there's no word mark, it's just ABC News in a fairly plain font. There's this huge chunk of tags that occur before the header image, which you normally, right, these might be buried at the bottom of the article or maybe in a side column or something like that. And as you go on down, you'll begin to see some things that look like a traditional news story. For instance, the byline of the writer here or some of these blue hyperlinks. But if you look a little closer, like if you click on this hyperlink that says 8 justices, it just takes you to the Wikipedia page that lists the name of the 8 justices currently on the Supreme Court. If you click the byline for the author, it takes you to this page, where you can see some of this author's other contributions, including 6 amazing places to get free stock photos and videos from, and resolve debt issues in a wise manner. So if you begin to click through, you start to see, like, there's nothing really corroborating this story in any of these links. They're just linking you to sort of facts that don't actually relate to sort of the narrative that's being established here. Let's see, if I click forward here. So if you compare this to the actual ABC News website, right, you see this logo up at the top. You see the bylines featured in a much more reasonable place. You'll see even a little bit more sort of polish in terms of font choices and things like that. In short, these are all of the features of a content management system with a site designed by professionals who may or may not enjoy the ways that their lives are currently going. And so to whatever extent fake news is a digital problem, I want to say that helping students to learn to recognize these web design features can be at least as important as getting them in the habit of fact-checking websites. And after all, I mean, this can be something where if they click on a site, right, if they don't just stop with the Twitter or the Facebook post, but actually click through, they might be able to notice an amateurish website before they even read the first sentence and just get out of there without having to get pulled into that narrative and do the fact-checking that comes along with it. And I should also note, as someone who studies rhetoric, right, that with these stories, I mean, fact-checking can be a pretty ineffective strategy for challenging them. And many of you may have encountered this, where you poke a hole in someone's narrative, right, and they're going to double down on it instead of suddenly thanking you for freeing them from this prison of misinformation. It's the narrative that these stories are situated in, whether it's that the government is run by lizard people or that the Democrats are doing horrible things in the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizza restaurant, right? These narratives are the things that draw people in, and sometimes they're resistant to fact-checking of all kinds of different sorts. But that's kind of a story for a different day. So my other suggestion, quickly, is sort of an analogical extension of decades of research about grammar instruction. So writing and education researchers have found for decades that sort of the old traditional way of teaching grammar, where you put a sample sentence up on the board, right, and you have students identify and fix errors with it, is one of the least effective ways to teach grammar that there is. It's much more effective where you have students with their own piece of writing that they've actually invested some sort of time and energy in, and then beginning to get in the habit of identifying these errors in their own papers. That's much more likely to actually carry over and become a sustained habit, whereas the sort of worksheet skill and drill approach might make students very good at identifying other people's mistakes, but often doesn't translate into their own writing. So by extension of this sort of principle, I want to suggest that we should allow students to try their hand at writing their own fake news stories, looking very carefully at pieces of real news and pieces of fabricated or fraudulent news, figuring out how people try to go about passing off fabricated news as real news, and then writing side-by-side stories that ideally you would workshop in a class, like put them up side by side on the screen and have the rest of the class try to figure out which one is the real story and which one is the fake story. And my hope would be that by getting invested in this process of just even trying to just like dupe the rest of the class, that students would pay much closer attention to these fine-grained details of what fabricated news looks like and how it tries to pass itself off in a way that would stick in the way that the relatively sort of colder exercise of looking at other people's fake news stories and breaking them down might not be able to accomplish. So that's what I've got, and thank you so much for the time.
So far, so good. Everybody has been very diligent about their time, so thank you very much. Faculty, really good at following instructions.
I'm actually going to sit if everyone can hear me. I don't have an audio-visual.
Yeah, so next up is Betsy Dalton from the Department of Communication Studies and Organizational Communication.
Yes. Hey, everyone. So I'm in my second year here at MTSU. And one of the classes that I'm teaching this semester is called Organizational Communication Analysis. And the way that I am teaching it is as it's a social science research course. So I don't know if anyone in here teaches any kind of science courses or research methods courses, but whether you do or not, I think this can be sort of useful. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we evaluate scientific research as it comes to us through the news. Teaching this class, a lot of communication majors want to know, well, why do I need to know how to do statistics? Why do I have to be in here? And so I tell them about why it's important to be able to not only produce your own research, but almost more importantly, on the other side of that, is that they are, throughout their lives, going to be consumers of research. And it is everywhere, and it is always coming at them. And once you start to pay attention to it, even we will all notice the same thing. So this is fresh on my mind because last week we sort of introduced this idea, and they were challenged with bringing in some sort of news article that cited research. And the funny thing was, when we went around and they talked about this piece of research that they found in the news, and I'd say, well, okay, and where did you find it? What was the source? Everyone was sort of like, oh, well, I don't know. And they'd be looking at the URL on the top of their printout, and they really had to think about, well, where did I find this? So I think it's sort of similar to what Molly was saying about tracing the origin of something all the way through to its coming at us as a news source. So one thing that I have them do is we look at we find a research study, and we looked at one, and the title of it is, and this is from the University of Exeter, let's see, and this was published in Medicinal Chemistry Communications, so I don't know what it means. The title is The Synthesis and Functional Evaluation of a Mitochondria-Targeted Hydrogen Sulfide Donor, and then it lists some numbers. Triphenylphosphonium bromide. Okay? And then a line from the end of that abstract that sort of sums it up says, our study suggests mitochondria-targeted H2S donors are useful pharmacological tools to study the mitochondrial physiology of H2S in health and disease. Okay? This is what they found. This is in the journal. Okay. All right. But then I explained to them that, this here is a peer-reviewed journal, and many large research institutions will also have their own sort of media agents who are there to put on maybe the university news page, like here's the research that's being done here, or creating press releases to then send to the news. So this is from the University of Exeter research news page, and same study. Rotten egg gas holds key to healthcare therapies. Okay. All right, so that I can sort of at least grab onto the meaning a little bit. And it is meant for a larger, less specialized public, so okay. And there's sort of some of the lines from that article are a new compound called AP39, designed and made here at University of Exeter, could hold the key to future therapies by targeting delivery of very small amounts of the substance that they've synthesized here to key places inside cells. Okay. But, the truth is that most reporters and producers, if they were to get a press release like this, they're not going to go back to the original peer-reviewed study and say, well, what's really going on here? What was the p-value or whatever, So this is, we've moved from the peer-reviewed research to the sort of press release to what you might hear on, say, the Today Show or this from Time magazine. Scientists say smelling farts might prevent cancer. And from another website, this was called UPI, I hadn't heard of it. Scientists say sniffing farts could prevent cancer. So what I explained to the students is that, at each step along the way, this is getting not just distorted, but it's not even what they were saying. It's not even true anymore. And if you were to go look for this article in Time now, they've printed a correction, and they've changed the title, and they said, we're sorry, we what did they say? We interpreted the implications of this study in the first iteration, and they've since changed it. But looking at this and looking these up really illustrates to students what happens along the way as we try to sexify and make relevant scientific research, and why that's sort of dangerous. And what I tell them is, look, what you're gaining in a class like this is that you're becoming relevant, even if you don't understand medicinal chemistry at all. If you wanted to go back and really look into a study that you're hearing about in the news, now you have the tools to. And we'll be coming to the library to do a little bit of exercise in that. And you can at least sort of make some sense out of that original research, but seeing how it gets distorted along the way is pretty useful. And there is Mary Beth Asbury, who's here, sent along. There's a great John Oliver clip about this. It is very funny. And we watched it in class, and he cites this example. Just talking about the problem of reporting scientific news in the media and how quickly it can get distorted. The only other thing I'll say, just to echo what Ken was saying, is when it comes to how do we evaluate the credibility of a news source, is what I tell students is to find out what happens when they mess up. How is it handled when a journalist says something that's just completely false or exaggerated or doesn't have a source? What happens to that person? How does the website or the print, how do they handle it? Because if they just say pull the article and it's never spoken of again and they don't own the mistake, that's a bad sign. It means that they don't have a whole lot of value for the truth, or if they just do nothing about it. So that's just another thing to pass along to students when it comes to source credibility. But that was about all I had. That was pretty quick. Oh, yes.
next up we have Ryan Corsani from University Studies.
All right. Hang on. Let me figure out this. Okay. Oh, that's going to be good enough. All right. So I teach in University Studies. I teach University 1010, which is a freshman level class. And a big part of what we try to do in the class is help students understand the expectations that they kind of have on them once they come to college. And so information literacy is a big part of what we're trying to do. And so what I want to talk about today is just an assignment that we use in class. I'm borrowing in this assignment a lot of methodology that Jeremy Strayer has developed over in Math Ed, and something that he calls a Kickstarter activity, and it's borrowing from the flipped classroom model. Okay, so basically what he's saying is get students to do something significant out of class and bring that to class, and then have students interact with that in class to create new knowledge, right? Okay, so that's the larger kind of pattern for what I'm doing. Okay, so the assignment that I give students, or one assignment that I give students, and this is transferable, I think, into a lot of contexts. But, okay, so find two sources that you think provide reliable information about how to be successful in college, right? That's kind of what we're trying to talk about in the class, so it's very relevant to our topic, okay? In a Word document, give me some information about the source so I can find it. Okay, and then we'll talk about citations at another point in the class. And then, most importantly, explain why you think it's reliable, right? Give me a good explanation of what it is that's reliable about this source. Okay, so I will take this into class, right? This kind of information. It's kind of an extracted view of what students said about stuff. Okay, so here's the first example, and this was from a class I had last semester. I haven't done this yet this semester. But about 5 students found this article from Rasmussen College and said, this is a reliable source because, right? It's written by a college. Right? So that's interesting, right? So now in class, we can have conversations about authorship and how a college is not really an author, right? And then we can, or this one, it's from a college's website. Well, now we can think about, well, how do we know that Rasmussen College is an authoritative source, right? And we can have this conversation. What students have heard about this college? Well, it's nobody, right? How do we know if this college is a reliable source for student success? Maybe we would want to look at their graduation rate or something like that. Maybe we'd want to look at their student success office, other literature that they have about student success, right? So we can have this larger conversation about this source. But because we ask students to kind of solidify their thinking about reliability, it gives them a different place to enter the conversation, right? It's not abstract. It's not performance. It's not, this is what I think you want me to say, right? It's more real and more experiential for them, right? Okay, so there's some comments about the reliability of the author. The site gives information about the author. There's a bio page at the bottom, a bio paragraph. Right? So because there's information about the author, it seems reliable. Well, then we can have a conversation about, well, what makes a reliable author on this topic, right? So it's not a college, right? So what kind of person is kind of allowed to or can participate authoritatively in this conversation about college success? Okay? The author is well known. Okay? So now we can have a conversation about what that means and why that's meaningful and how that impacts authority. She has worked in education for over 3 years. That's interesting. And she has a degree in psychology. That's also interesting, right? So now we can have conversations about experience, about education, and the way that contributes to authority, right? Okay. And then there was some really interesting comments about content. When we were talking earlier about fraudulent news, some of the comments that came up were we use fraudulent news to confirm what we already know, right? Well, it was troubling to me that a lot of the students' comments about reliability came to the content was what I already thought about college success, right? So, okay, whatever. I agree with the content that it's providing, right? That's one of the most clear, problematic statements, right? So then we can have a conversation about content in reliable sources and how you use content and about how, maybe it's great to agree with some parts of the content, but what if you don't agree? Does that make it unreliable fundamentally? Not necessarily. So how do we think through content that we agree or don't agree with, right? Okay, so that's kind of the framework for an assignment that I use and for a way to get into discussion with students about what they actually think. I have some other examples, but I think we're out of time, so I won't belabor the point. Getting students to articulate what they think about reliability, I think, is such an important deal. And then talking about the limitations and advantages of their approach, right? That's where I think learning happens in the classroom, and I think it's interesting. It's been fun, at least for me. So, all right, that's it, I think.
Ryan just yielded 2 minutes to me, so thank you, Ryan. Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so let me reset my timer here. Okay, so finally I'm going to chime in from the library's perspective, being the librarian on the panel. And I want to talk just briefly about the concept of authority. Traditionally in academia, there are two factors by which we grant authority to a text. One of those is the type of publication. In this case, on the screen, I have a book. The other big venue for academics is professional journals. And there are exceptions in various fields, but by and large, academic journals and books. And in this case, we have a book that's published by the University of Chicago Press. So far, so good. The second factor by which we grant authority is the credentials of the author. In this case, we have an author who is an assistant professor at Harvard University. Well, there you go. So this person is pretty authentic. By that top level cursory look, this is a pretty authoritative source. But there are a lot of nuances there, and as faculty members, as graduate students, we are pretty good at giving our sources that we are going to be citing and that we're reading and that we're using for our classes and our research, at giving this kind of top-level cursory review for authority. But our undergraduate students, especially our lower-level undergraduate students, may not have that innate skill, and I'm guessing based on the previous presentations that could use some refinement. In the library world, for several years, librarians have depended largely on checklists, evaluation checklists. And here at MTSU, we have, for several years, adopted this one from California State University, Chico. All of these things have cute little acronyms and names. So this is cleverly, but also crudely, named the CRAP test. C-R-A-A-P being an acronym that walks students through an exhausting, not exhaustive, but exhausting list of questions about any potential source related to its currency, its relevance, its authority, its accuracy, and its purpose. And while these have served us well for many years, they are gradually beginning to fall out of favor in the library world because the one-size-fits-all checklist approach hasn't really adapted well to other types of information that are not journal articles and are not books. So when a student shows up with a YouTube video in their works cited page or a Twitter thread or a blog post or a podcast, this one-size-fits-all checklist may not exactly cut it. And it's been my experience that even using this template or this checklist, that often students get so bogged down in the details of the questions that they miss the big picture. And they're reviewing an Onion article, or they're reviewing, something. Oh, well, this, it's got an author, check. And so they kind of miss the forest for the trees. Well, in 2015, the Association of College and Research Libraries introduced a new document in the library world that sought to redefine information literacy. It intentionally moved away from a long-standing view of information literacy as a skill or a set of abilities, and instead reintroduced it as a set of key concepts about how students interact with information, how they not only consume information, but how they create information, and scholarship generally. In the library world, this was not without controversy. These existing standards have been around since 2001. So we had lived with them for 14 years. People had worked them into their gen ed curricula. And so now here we are with a new set of a framework, a theoretical framework to replace those standards. One of those key concepts from the framework is this idea that authority is constructed and contextual. The whole thing reads like this. So I want to dig into that for just a second here. So this is wording from the framework, the ACRL framework. And essentially what it's saying is that authority, different people may recognize different authority, different signs of authority. We see that in our everyday lives. People, it's been established a couple of times up here, people gravitate towards the news that reinforces their political biases or their cultural biases. People seek out those things, and they have a hard time giving them up once they have them. Even in academia, we find that some publications are seen as being top tier or high quality, and if you publish in lesser journals, then But some publications and even some scholars are seen as being traditional, while others are maybe seen as subscribing to a particular school of thought. So this context, or this constructed authority, happens both in our everyday lives and also in our professional academic lives. Authority can also be contextual, according to the framework. And often as faculty members, we are setting that context. So you might have told your students, you need to cite 2 books. Or don't turn in a paper that doesn't have 3 academic journals in the works cited page. We're creating that context for them. But that may be an unfamiliar context for them. In the library, we're seeing more and more cases where faculty, where you are sending students to us who are doing research and are writing papers and doing projects, where they are now beginning to supplement some of that traditional information with more modern types of information. For example, a student who's writing a paper on homelessness. So maybe they're doing an essay for an English class or a speech for a public speaking class on homelessness. They might find their 3 traditional research journals and find their 2 books, but maybe it's an experiential learning class or it's an MT Engage class where they are going out into the community and doing things outside of the classroom. They're talking to people who work in the field. They are interviewing people who are homeless for a paper on homelessness and bringing those voices back into the conversation. So in that case, the concept of authority is suddenly shifted based on the context in which they're writing and in which they're working. I think that's kind of a cool thing. So, so what do we do with this stupid checklist, right? So the checklist is still there, and the checklist serves a utility, and we still use these. We still have these written into our curriculum. We have these on our library website, but more and more the framework suggests that we should be having conversations with our students about how authority is constructed and how it is contextual. And it sounds like that's what's happening in all of these examples that we talked about, and I'm sure some of you are doing this in your classes as well. But when we think about authority being constructed, sometimes it's having that conversation with the student about who would be an authoritative voice in this situation. Who are the experts? And if we disagree about who the authorities are. So if I'm a student and I'm writing a paper about homelessness and you're the professor who's assigned these strict guidelines for me, maybe the onus is on the student to explain as you're introducing a quote into your paper or introducing a reference into your works cited page, why that's a good reference for this paper. What is the context? And explaining how that has been constructed. Also, I think a lot of our students, and Eric's slide was great about the .edu good, .com bad. But the other thing that the checklist, I think, fails to do is that sometimes students will come in with an essay that was published or an op-ed that was published in the New York Times. Great article, lots of statistics, lots of factual information. The person is an expert in the field. But if you do a little digging, maybe the person is a paid lobbyist who works for them. And so there are all these little nuances that we have to tease out with students. And so having conversations about, because I think at that top level, most students recognize that Yahoo Answers is not a credible, authoritative source for your paper, or about.com has no business in your works cited page for a college paper. But where do we draw the lines? Are tweets by professionals fair game? Are podcasts that are in the vein of scholarship fair game? So just having that conversation about, this is a college paper, this is a paper for a class, who is your audience, and do we recognize the same kinds of authority, and just kind of having that conversation. But it sounds like in all of these examples that that's already happening. The framework ultimately suggests that we should aim for finding a good balance between teaching our students to have an informed skepticism, and that permeates all disciplines and all fields, but also balancing that with an openness to new perspectives. So looking at not only the things that have been published, but the power structures that enable those things to be published. So looking for marginalized voices in certain conversations, looking at controversial theories, and finding how those fit into the larger narrative of research and the conversations that they're engaging in as new scholars. So I'm encouraged by what I've heard here from the other speakers, and we have a few minutes left here. So what I would encourage you to do is look at those notes you made, and we have panelists standing by, ready to answer your questions. So
Before you break, let me just mention, after my impassioned defense of a free press, a free press is available to each and every one of you, a free subscription to the New York Times for you and every member of your classes. Best way to convince them that news can be authoritative and accurate is to let them read it every day. This is I'll sound like I'm selling cars now, a $200 retail value. Yours absolutely free. But it's critical that we get much use of the New York Times in classrooms as possible, because that's how we're going to make the case to continue these subscriptions. And so if you can make it part of your assignment, that's really good. But even if you only go and sign up, and encourage your colleagues to, we've been at this for about 6 months now, and we have a universe of 25,000. Actually a universe potentially of 35,000 people, I suspect, in the end. We had about 912 sign up in the first 6 months. So if you have not, please do that. Provost's office sent out instructions, but the way to beat fabricated news is with the real thing.
questions, comments?
I'd also like to hear if anybody else is doing things like this in the classroom and what they're doing.
So I teach large non-majors biology courses, and the first assignment is to go find a product that you use, the advertisement for that. And there's a series of prompts where students are guided to evaluate the science behind the claim. So clinically proven. It's an amazing experience, I think, for a lot of students to find out what Crest is really talking about. And then if directed, go to the website and who's funding the studies, and where's the money. So it's really, it's a great way to begin the course, actually. Set up, what's the nature of scientific knowledge.
Any other examples?
I teach classes in television production and college media and entertainment. And this semester I'm teaching an online class about the history and development of television networks. And the first week we were talking, it was kind of an overview about the environment, about social media and their use of it. And one of the questions was, how often are you on social media in a day? And then how much relevance do you put to what you see in social media? And I shouldn't be stunned because I've been here long enough to see the perpetual addiction of iPhones, but student after student were saying they were on social media 9 to 10 hours a day, some up to 12. And I commented once that means 75% of your waking day are on social media. Is that accurate? And then when they were talking about how much validity they put to it, they seemed to think that if they see the same thing in several different places in social media, it must be right. I thought, oh boy, got a lot of work. 9 to 10, well, some of them 10 to 12, even though they admit they're on there too much. It's just too addictive. So I don't know how we address that, except maybe make them a little bit more aware of their addiction.
I have
be more discerning.
I'm in the social department. I teach research at the undergraduate level. And I, right early on, asked that the students know that they really don't know that much. And that in this class, we're not going to spend our time confirming what they think they know, but I challenge them to go out and to disprove what they think they know, but they hold really tight. So it's kind of counterintuitive for them, and they really struggle with it. So they really have to look on unusual places to find whatever their passion is, or that social topic or injustice that they're powerful about, that they're very passionate about. I have them look for something that disagrees with their idea, and then evaluate. You've done this work. Has it changed the way you look at this topic, by this disproving of it? And it's pretty good. It actually changes many students' ideas.
That reminds me of a colleague of mine who was educated in a French system in West Africa, and he was always taught a model of history writing where you write your thesis and the antithesis, that you have a point and a counterpoint, and that's something that I think is typically fallen out. I typically just argued my point and then found evidence for that. And so I think it is really important to dig deeply into counter-arguments. Right.
Teaching them completely different ways, the scientific process
Mm-hmm.
to disprove things you know.
Any other examples that you would like to share? Questions for our panelists?
Let me share the inverse. I teach a First Amendment law course. One of their assignments is to come back with 5 examples of satire or parody. My biggest problem is they keep coming with real news stories.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.
The onion's too good.
All right, well,
I think that's a simple question to have. Has it gotten worse? Has the students of looking at information, are they worse than they were 5 years ago? And looking at authority, looking at information,
My impression is that what's changed is the ease of getting certain information. So, I mean, like, I knew when I was studying, right? I mean, like, I went to college back in the day of the card catalog, right? That's how I knew to find information first, right? And that was like, you knew there was good information in there, right? And so you could find it. And today, I think students are they're pressed for time on all quarters, and they just look for something that's easy and easy to understand, and that, like, subsumes all these other bigger picture criteria for authority or whatever. And so it's just ease of use is, I think, a big criteria.
Well, if you compare it to maybe 5 years ago, I just wondered if the current political climate has really worsened the fraudulent news assertions and the examples that everybody sees with accusations, and the news media has started, instead of analyzing it, showing it. This is what they said. We're not making this up. That kind of thing. And I miss the days when there was some analysis.
I think for me, I don't know if this has come across as optimistic or cynical, but I have my students read a short piece from Politico that's about the circulation of anti-Semitic claims of blood libel in medieval Europe, where there were claims that these poor innocent Christian children were, like, murdered by these groups of Jewish people. And so, I mean, I would say not even 5 years, but like 500 years. Like, some things are different in terms of circulation, but this isn't a new phenomenon. Whether that's hopeful or not, I don't really know. And certainly there's things that are pertinent to our particular political moment. But I don't know. I don't know that it's necessarily worse. It's just how students are able to go out and maybe find information. It's not a new problem, though.
I think one thing that's different than 5 years ago is that the authority now is your Uncle Joe who posted it. Like, oh my gosh, my grandparent thinks this is true. And, like you said, if it's posted multiple times, it's even truer. So 20 of my friends have posted that this is true. This is very near and dear to our hearts. And if you are only getting your information from Facebook, which many people are, and I'm not going to say students because I think it's true of all generations, you won't get other perspectives. You will only see the stories that matter to the people you know. So it creates the echo chamber that if you, 5 years ago, were getting a newspaper, or even if you watched television news, it wasn't that the authority was your friends, people you care about deeply already. So it is more like I feel that it's true more than I know it's true. Yes?
We basically mentioned that authority is constructed within a community that we create, and we are one community. But with viral media, that creates another community, often larger than our community, and authority is constructed there. So how do we mediate an authoritative community that we consider valid versus an authoritative community that contains real authority, even according to the definition of a community like a viral community that we don't consider valid or we don't consider as trustworthy? How do we deal with that? Because when a student says, well, if 15 million people say it, it must be true, and what's wrong with me believing that? And
I'm going to do my research paper on flat Earth.
Exactly.
Plenty of research that supports the flat Earth theory. And so, so how do you negotiate authority?
Where does the strength of the community end in becoming authority? I guess I'm asking.
But I feel like an individual chooses to allow different communities to have different authority over them, right? And so, like, my solution, it's not a temporary solution at least, would be to say, let's just raise the question with students, right? I mean, because I'm not sure we're doing that all the time. But why do you believe that, right? So 15 million people believe it. Okay, fine. Like, let's think of other things that 15 million people believe that you don't care about at all and you think is wrong, right? I mean, there's an example to be made there. We can make the same example about scholarship, but we can have a much more nuanced conversation about authority. And we need to have that conversation with the students.
That's what I can do. I'm just looking for another way.
Maybe there's another way.
Maybe. And I'm sorry.
This document from the Library Association is very new, and librarians are still kind of figuring it out. And part of what we're doing is engaging in conversations like this, so we can learn from each other and hear how faculty in different disciplines are doing these issues. So this has been very helpful for me personally. I hope it's been helpful for you too. Let's give our panelists another round of applause. Our formal time is up here, but we encourage you to hang out and share amongst yourselves and read our panels for you. Thank you.
Okay.